Hello and welcome to Merlin's Manor. Today I'm going over my top 10 board games of all time. I started this out going over my top 25 board games. You can check out 25 through 11 by clicking here or in the description below or at the end of this video. I highly recommend checking that out because there's a lot of games that I really enjoy that I all rate at least a 9 out of 10 on this full list. Now this list, I have gone ahead and combined some games that are in a series together and so that they don't take up multiple spots on the list. And I also, in order to make this list, went ahead and looked at my rankings of games and put all of my 10s, 9s, and 9.5s together, and then from there decide which ones within those rankings were higher and lower than others. So let's go ahead and jump right on in now to my final 10, my top 10 board games of all time, starting with Spirit Island. My number 10 game. Spirit Island is one of the heaviest games on this list in terms of complexity to learn and to play. Now, in this game, you are playing as a spirit trying to protect the island from invading settlers. You work with the native Dahan, utilizing your powers to scare the settlers away. Each spirit works very different, and there can be great synergies between spirits, as some focus more on defense, some more on offense, and even one just focuses on just straight up scaring the people away. Now, as the fear level goes up, it becomes easier to achieve the win condition as you go from having to clear out all the invaders from the island to just having to get rid of all the cities and towns, and eventually just the cities. You have fast powers, which you do before the invaders act, and slow powers, which you do after they act, which requires some planning ahead and understanding what needs to happen before the invaders and what can happen after as to what is going to be effective in the moment. The main thing you need to be concerned about is blight, which can cascade across the board if you are not careful. There is only so much blight which can be on the board, and if too much blight gets on the board, then it is game over. You'll also be putting out spirit presence on the board, which determines where you can act based on how close powers require you to be in an area to work. And if ever your last presence is removed from the board, you lose as well. You also lose if you take too long to win and the invader deck runs out. Now, throughout the game, your spirit levels up in a few ways. First of all, as you add presence to the board, it unlocks spaces on your spirit board, which will give you the ability to gain more energy, which you need to be able to have to play cards. You unlock the ability to play more cards on your turn, and you unlock symbols to help you perform innate abilities more consistently. Now, you start with some basic powers specific to your spirit, but you will gain other basic minor powers and eventually trade those in for major powers that are quite powerful cards. To win the game, you need to find powers that synergize well together and with your spirit in general, and focus on getting ahead of the invaders. You reveal a card on the invader's turn where they start exploring, and then on the next phase that moves to the build and finally the ravage area. And so you know where they're going to be building next and finally ravaging. And so instead of focusing too much on what is happening right now, you typically want to focus on getting ahead of what will be happening next. Even if it means sacrificing some losses in the moment, lose a few battles in order to win the war. This game is heavy on strategy and a lot of fun if you enjoy cooperative strategy games. I do believe it is best at lower player counts, 1 to 2 players being ideal, with 3 being good as well. Personally, when playing solo, I play true solo with 1 spirit, as I find playing with 2 spirits to be too brain-burny. But many do enjoy playing two-handed solo for the synergies between spirits, which is what makes us playing this game at 2 players really great, is that synergy between 2 spirits. The game will, however, start to drag on at higher player counts. Now, my number 9 game is Final Girl, which is a solo-only game based on the horror movie trope of there being one final girl who survives. There are currently 10 feature films based on 10 different horror movies with 2 small vignettes to play, with 5 more features and 1 more vignette coming soon. One of the coolest things about this game is that you can mix locations, killers, and final girls in any combination, which really adds a ton of replayability to the game, even in addition to the different events, items, and setups for each location, and different tarot cards for each location and killer. The game is very tactical in nature, causing you to have to react to what the killer is doing, and it requires good hand management to do well. You're going to be gaining cards by spending unused time after each round, and cards used this round are not available to gain for the next round. You have several zero-cost cards, as well as cards that cost between 1 and 6 times to purchase. You're going to be rolling dice to determine success or failure for every action that you do, as well as the level of success being either 1 success or 2 success being the better outcome. Each die has a 33% chance of being a success, as well as a 33% chance of being able to be converted into a success if you discard 2 cards to change the die face. So potentially 66% chance of success if you save some cards for the purpose of discarding. This is a major part of the luck mitigation involved in this game and requires that proper hand management. And sometimes it is a good idea to hold off until next round to do an action when you have more cards to spend if needed. Plus, it will save time for buying cards. As far as what you are doing, you're going to be scrambling to find helpful items, especially weapons, saving victims to get bonuses, and hopefully unlocking your final girl's special ability, as well as keeping them from being killed and increasing the killer's bloodlust. Eventually, you'll start attacking the killer when you feel like you are prepared enough. Each location and killer changes up how the game plays a bit by adding extra rules, with Hans at Camp Happy Trails having only the basic rules, which applies for every killer and location, so that's being a good starting point with no extra rules to learn. I just really enjoy the game and how much variation comes by adding on those extra feature films. This is also currently my most played game since it is fairly quick to play and easy to take a couple features with me on trips as well. That is my number 9 game, Final Girl. Now number 8 is Ark Nova, topping out the 9.5s. In this tableau building game, you are building out your zoo. As you add animals, you gain appeal, which serves as both victory points and levels of income. You will additionally be doing things related to conservation in order to gain victory points related to conservation, which is actually worth more for each point of conservation than the appeal is. The game ends when a player gets their conservation and appeal to cross, and then whoever crosses by the most, after all have taken a final turn and all additional points are calculated, wins the game. The game has a clever action selection mechanism where you choose one of the 5 actions to perform, and the further along the action is, the more it's going to be worth, thus incentivizing you to use different actions and wait until cards are towards the end of the track to do those actions to get the most out of them. I really enjoy building out a zoo, from the polyomino aspect of placing out pens and buildings to the collecting of animals and all the other actions that are involved. Similar to tableau building games like Terraforming Mars, some cards have tag requirements that need to be met before they can be played, including partnerships with zoos. The act of releasing animals in order to gain conservation points, which also frees up space in your zoo, is also an interesting one. Now thematically, this one falls short a little in that you can release the animal from any pen that meets the size requirement, since animals are not tracked once they're placed into your zoo, but this definitely makes sense from a gameplay standpoint. And when you release an animal, you do lose the appeal that they brought with them, since that animal is no longer at your zoo, which also makes sense thematically and adds an extra layer in the decision process of when to release animals and which ones to release. I really love the depth of strategy involved in this game, and there are quite a few paths to victory. Yes, ultimately you need to do conservation to stand any chance of winning, but you can use sponsors to help with that, animals that provide conservation points, releasing animals to gain those points, bonus cards, and association actions. Quite a few different paths. You also will be leveling up your actions during the game, and at most can level up 4 of your cards, potentially only 3 if you take an extra association worker instead of a card flip for that conservation bonus. This is another example of a game that I just really like the experience of building out something fun. I'm not too concerned with winning or losing as much as the journey. Though don't get me wrong, I definitely strive to win. It's just win or lose, it's so much fun just building up your zoo. Now let's move into the games that I rank a 10 out of 10 as I move into my top 7 games, starting with Everdell. Number 7. It's a charming worker placement game that is not too complicated to learn, though I often caution those new to the game not to expect to be able to do too much in their first season, as this can be disparaging if you don't realize that it's perfectly normal not to be able to play too many cards that first season. The game is a tableau building game that has some fun comboing, in that getting certain buildings built for you will allow you to place the corresponding critter for free. and sometimes powers that can trigger some interesting combinations as well. There's a degree of engine building to this game in green powers which trigger production up to 3 times during the game, and potentially more with certain cards. You need to balance gaining green production cards with other cards that are going to score you more points, since you have a max city size of 15 cards, with some cards that can be played outside your city, and some that expand the city size. There are so many strategies that come through as you play this game more and more that at first you may not have seen the advantages of. I've come to learn that there are no bad cards in the game, as every card has circumstances where they work really well. One rule that I originally did not appreciate that I have since come to understand the reason for it being there is that you cannot go over your hand limit and discard down like most games allow you to do. But now I understand that this adds an additional layer of strategy, especially when it comes to certain cards and space interactions. This is a game that I have all the expansions for, and I enjoy what each one adds to the game and how it changes the game up slightly to provide a different feel, with my favorite expansion being Spirecrest for the complexity that it adds to the game. I also highly recommend Belfair, if for nothing else than for the better event cards, since the event cards were one of the biggest weaknesses from the base game, as they required specific combinations of cards that may not even show up in the game in order to complete those events. This is a great hand management, resource management, worker placement game that is light enough in rules complexity to not be too intimidating to casual players, as well as enough depth of strategy to provide interesting gameplay for those wanting some meat, especially if you add the Spirecrest expansion. One final note concerning solo play: I personally found the original solo mode to be okay, not good or great, but the Mistwood expansion provides a great solo mode if you are fine with learning a somewhat complex automated opponent system, with plenty of ways to change things up, which I have not even had the chance to check out yet, and yet I love it for that solo mode that I've already tried. Now for number 6 is Wingspan. Wingspan has dropped a little for me over the years just because a few other games have supplanted it, but it's still one of my favorite games. I enjoy the tableau building and engine building aspects of this game. It is simple to learn but has a great depth of strategy, especially as expansions have come out for it and increased the depth of the game with each expansion. You have a limited amount of actions each round, which gets tighter as the game goes on, since you place one action cube on the goal tracker, providing one less action each round. And you use these actions to gain resources, eggs, cards, and to play birds. When doing those first 3 actions, you'll also be running any engine of brown powers on birds in that row, making birds with brown powers very powerful to get out early game to provide benefits throughout the game. There are several paths to victory that players can focus on, from tucking bird cards for a point each, gaining eggs for points, bird cards which have point values themselves, bonus cards, and competitive round goals. There are different types of bird powers, from the one-time when played powers to those brown engine-building birds I mentioned earlier, to pink powers that relate to what others do, to end-of-round powers, and finally end-of-game powers. The Oceania expansion also adds Nectar as a resource, and spending Nectar as an additional scoring opportunity. Oceania also rebalanced the player boards in order to nerf eggs while making the gaining of food a little easier, and providing some additional actions you can take when running a row. The Asia expansion added a head-to-head mode with an additional board and special 2-player round goals related to that new board. I just really love the various strategies you can take in this game depending on which birds come up, and if you have all the expansions, then there are a ton of different birds which will provide different synergies to look for each game. With a lot of these tableau building games with these large deck of cards, some tend to complain that there are just too many cards to reliably get what you want. But that's all part of the game, working with what comes out to make a good combination, and that keeps the game varied. You can't just do the same strategy every game and be successful. The game forces you to innovate and try new things, especially when you get more and more cards through the expansions. So Wingspan is my number 6. Now for my number 5, we have Wormspan, the game that built upon Wingspan's foundation. And some might argue that I should have picked one out of the 2 of these games for this list, but I feel like these games are different enough to warrant both being on this list. While Wingspan has much more content at this time due to the expansions, Wormspan wins out for two reasons. One, a higher complexity level and thus higher depth of strategy, and two, dragons. I like the theme. A lot of what I said about Wingspan now also applies to Wormspan as far as the engine building goes, but then you have the coin system for actions, which gives 6 each round with the ability to earn more, and with some dragons costing an extra coin to play, basically costing 2 actions to play. You also have a Dragon Guild track, which gives bonuses as you go up it, as well as some special abilities and scoring opportunities that you can take advantage of whenever you reach the top and bottom of this circular track. You also have baby dragons that add some abilities that trigger as you feed them when running the row engines, and powerful one-time abilities that trigger after doing an action 3 times. You also have bonuses that you can trigger by getting to the end of each cave, which incentivizes filling up your rows. You also have an extra step to take before playing dragons of having to excavate the caves, which gives you various bonuses on those cave cards that you play. This game takes all that is great about Wingspan and then just adds more to think about, plus potential for gaining more actions instead of the number of actions going down each round. There are also actions that can be quite combo-y, where one action triggers another, and that can be quite fun. I really enjoy this game, and I do not find that it totally replaces Wingspan, but given the choice between the two, I'm definitely leaning towards Wormspan, both for the added complexity and the theme being more appealing overall. Now coming in at number 4 is the Castles of Burgundy. Castles of Burgundy is a game that I took my time to pull the trigger on. The first time I was intrigued by the game was after watching a solo playthrough by Paula Deming, but I was still a little turned off by the look of the game. It just looked kind of bland. Then when Awakened Realms came out with the special edition that just looked amazing, I finally pulled the trigger, and I now really love this game both for multiplayer and solo play. I really enjoyed the clever use of dice to direct actions, but with some mitigation by using workers. I really like all the different tiles in the game and how you have certain areas of your duchy for certain types, and as you finish off areas, you're able to score bonuses, with larger areas granting higher scores, but the smaller areas being easier to finish off quickly, giving you the ability to score additional bonus points for finishing them in the earlier rounds of the game. There are so many different strategies to focus on in this game, and it's a bit of a point salad which just works so well. The yellow monastery tiles either give powerful ongoing abilities or endgame scoring goals to focus on. The brown building tiles give instant actions. The blue ship tiles allow you to gain goods that you can sell later on and advances you on the turn order track. The green livestock tiles give you points that increases every time you get more of the same animal in that same area. The gray mine tiles give you coin income, which you can spend to gain black market tiles, which is basically an extra action. And then the red castle tiles give you extra actions. You have 2 die actions each round, and your main actions are either to gain a tile to your storage or place a tile from your storage into your duchy. But sometimes you don't have the right number for what you want to do, so instead you may choose to spend a die to gain workers, which will allow you to change the die face on your future actions. And the final action option is to use a die to sell goods for victory points and to gain 1 coin. There's just a lot going on in this game, which is what I love about it. And the special edition comes with plenty of expansion materials which change up the game. Most of them make some minor changes, and so you can easily decide to include a few of them in your game, while others make some major changes to the gameplay for when you really want to change up the feel of the game. The special edition also comes with 2 solo modes. The original solo mode, which challenges you to complete your duchy in 25 rounds, with some rules adjustments that focus around gaining actions rather than scoring points, and points themselves getting converted into actions. And it has an automated opponent as well that you can play with. Some have complained that the original mode got old quickly. While its novelty hasn't worn off on me as of yet, I can see how some feel that way. Though I do enjoy the different challenge. But the addition of that automa should add plenty of replayability for solo for those who enjoy playing against an automated opponent. Overall, Castles of Burgundy is an amazing game with plenty of depth of strategy, and now looks great with the special edition, which is why it is my number 4 game of all time. And now for my number 3 game, that is Terraforming Mars. While Terraforming Mars was not the first modern board game I was introduced to, It was fairly early on in the lineup of games I was taught to play by my friend who introduced my wife and I to modern board games, and it's one of the games that really drew me into my love for playing board games, and still one of my favorites, obviously, as it's number 3 on my list. I really enjoy the engine building in this game as you build out your tableau of cards that give you resource production and cards that give you actions, discounts, and other effects. This is another game that has so many different paths to victory based around finding cards that synergize well together. The game starts out with you having very limited resources and resource production. The first round you'll usually be able to get out a few good cards, and in the second and third round sometimes you can only get out a couple cards. But then things start to really ramp up, and by the final generation you're playing several cards or performing several actions. And I really enjoy this arc where you start out struggling, but you're able to build up your resource production to the point where you can get a lot done each generation. The payoff feels great. This is also another game where as you gain more victory points in the form of terraforming rating, you'll be gaining more money to spend as well, giving it a dual benefit. You also have a race to achieve milestones and has the ability to fund awards, which you will then compete with others for first and second place. This adds some tension not only in the competition, but also in the decision to fund an award, because you could be spending money just to give someone else points if they seize the opportunity to surpass you in that area. So you have to weigh the odds of achieving first place prior to funding an award. But if you wait too long to fund an award, it could cost you more to fund because others have funded awards, or even be unable to fund that award because 3 other awards were already funded. There's also some tension in how much you spend building up your engine versus how much you focus on increasing the terraforming parameters to gain points and to push the end game, as well as gaining cards that give you points. Striking the proper balance is important, and gauging how fast others are pushing the end game is also important in calculating what you should be focusing on. There's also an area control aspect of the game as you're trying to place out cities, but typically they cannot go next to other cities, and then trying to get greenery surrounding your cities for extra points. And it can be quite fun to place your city with a handful of greeneries already surrounding it that others have placed. But you do need to try to beat others to those spots, especially as they become more valuable. There is some negative interaction in this game between destroying people's plants, stealing resources, lowering opponents' production, and potentially hate drafting if you are playing with the drafting mechanism, which I highly recommend playing with the drafting mechanism, as it allows not only for more interaction, but also mitigates luck of the draw, as well as allows players to find synergies easier between their cards. The negative player actions in this game are not too invasive overall, as a lot of the game is focused simply on what you are building with only a limited number of cards that have those negative player interactions. I do highly recommend always playing with the Preludes expansion, as it jump-starts early game production and speeds up the game quite a bit. I really enjoy Terraforming Mars, as it is my number 3 game of all time. And now for my number 2 game of all time, Isle of Cats. This is the game that sparked my love for polyomino tile placement games. It has been affectionately referred to as Tetris Cats. The primary thing you're trying to do in this game is place cats on your board to cover up spaces, as well as to create groupings of the same colored cats to score points. You will score negative points for each unfilled room, so you have to optimize the filling of the rooms to have the least amount of negative points. Additionally, you will score points for bonus cards and rare treasures, and lose 1 point for each uncovered rat. Each round starts out with card drafting and then purchasing cards that you bought, which will give you baskets to collect cats, lesson cards for points, boots to determine player order, treasure cards, special Oshak's cat cards, and a number of play for an immediate benefit type cards. You have to balance buying cards with your fish, with saving fish to be able to draft cats. You also decide which cards to play each round that have baskets and boots, so you can buy some to save up for future rounds. If you have more baskets, then you'll be able to afford to gain cats. I really enjoy the puzzle of trying to figure out how to fit cats on my board, as well as puzzling out which cards that I can afford to buy and will be of greatest benefit for me. It is difficult to balance gaining lessons with the things that will give you more cats onto your boat. You also typically have to give in to the idea that you're not going to be able to fill all of your rooms and decide which rooms to prioritize. And again, balance filling rooms with getting lessons and the other ways of scoring points. There's also a family mode to this game, which we have primarily played with our kids, but also provides a good introduction to playing the game and may also be a preferred way to play for casual gamers. In the family mode, you do not draft cards or pay fish, but rather you start with lesson cards and you will simply be drafting cats and placing them on your board while trying to maximize filling spaces and scoring points for your lessons and scoring for groupings of cats. There are also some great expansion materials for this game that add some subtle changes and additional ways to score points, which I can highly recommend. The solo mode is also very good for this game, providing an interesting additional puzzle to crack due to the fact that the things you do will score points for your opponent, which can really force you to play a little differently than in the multiplayer game. There's also a smaller box flip and write version of Isle of Cats, which plays a little differently, which I find worthwhile and would have made my honorable mentions if not for me considering it to be simply an alternate version of Isle of Cats. And Frank just came out with a 2-player dual version of Isle of Cats, which is currently in pre-order. I really cannot say enough good stuff about Isle of Cats. Our whole family has enjoyed playing this game, and it is my second favorite game of all time. And now, my number 1 game of all time is Gloomhaven. This includes Jaws of the Lion and will include Frosthaven and Crimson Scales once we get around to playing them. Jaws of the Lion is where I would recommend starting out, as it has tutorial missions which ease you into the game and teach you various mechanics a bit at a time. Gloomhaven has the second most plays out of any game for me, probably the most if we were to add Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion, and Gloomhaven together. And it most certainly has the most hours of play for me, since the games take a few hours to play each one, especially if you're playing 2 characters apiece, like my wife and I have been doing. Gloomhaven is a dungeon crawling game where you have a character with cards that you will be playing to do attacks, buffs, and in order to move around. Each round you will choose 2 cards to play. You'll use one for the top ability and one for the bottom ability. Some cards are super powerful and will be lost when you use them, which means that they go away for the game. And so you have to be careful to save them for the right opportunity, since your cards also represent your stamina, and when you run out of cards, you exhaust and your character is out of the game. And in order to get your non-lost cards back, you're going to have to rest and lose a card. So eventually even your use of standard cards will lead you to exhaust. You can also lose cards to negate all damage received by an attacker or other source of damage. The balance you need to strike between losing cards is a huge part of the game, and striking that balance can mean the difference between winning or losing a scenario. There's so much content in the box of Gloomhaven. There's about 100 scenarios and 17 characters, plus the Diviner and Forgotten Circles, and then you have the 4 characters in Jaws of the Lion. It's a lot of fun unlocking new cards for your character, leveling up your attack modifier deck, getting cool items, and then eventually retiring your character as you unlock a new character that you can learn and play as. The one negative that I have about the game is that most scenarios simply have the goal, kill all monsters, and I would appreciate a little more variety of goals there. But the fun of discovering new characters and trying out new abilities more than makes up for that, in my opinion. And there are some more creative goals, plus many different monsters and layouts of maps to keep things fresh enough for me. This is a very complex game, and thus not easy to learn. I would say this is the most complex game on this list, coming from a rules perspective, followed by Spirit Island, which is why I highly recommend starting out with Jaws of the Lion in order to ease yourself into the rules a bit. And so this has been my top 10 board games of all time, and of course if you watch my other video, my top 25 board games of all time, you can check the rest of my games out here if you need to check the rest of that list out. And I hope you've enjoyed this list, maybe giving some games to think about, and I hope you have a great week and keep on gaming.